Hey, what's going on, guys? So today we're going to go ahead and talk about GraphQL. We're going to go ahead and talk about what GraphQL is and why we should use it. And then we're also going to go ahead and get started on setting up a simple GraphQL project. So first of all, what exactly is GraphQL? Well, GraphQL stands for Graph Query Language. That's what the QL stands for. And you can basically use it as an alternative to REST. Now, we'll make it clear that you cannot actually use GraphQL to 100% replace REST. There are some things, well, there are some use cases where you might need REST for some certain things, usually authentication or webhooks, for example. But it's a great way to query your API. So that way, instead of having to make so many different API calls on your client side, for example, the React app or Angular app, you can just make one API call to the GraphQL server, and then it'll return everything to you, whatever it is that you ask for. Now, some key points that I want to mention about GraphQL is that GraphQL will only give you what you ask for. It won't give you more or less. So let's look at an example over here that's already on the GraphQL website. You can see we have this hero type over here, and this hero type can have different fields. It has a name, it has a height, and you can see as they are typing each field, it's just appearing in the query. That's exactly what's going on. So if you were to execute this query, it would give you only the fields that you ask for. So it would give you the hero, and then what it is of the hero that we want. Well, we want the name, the height, and that's it. And we can ask for more, or we can ask for less. So this is a good thing because there are times where some APIs, let's say if you're working with some REST API, it might end up giving you a ton of data that you just don't necessarily want to deal with. So depending on how you handle it, some people end up transforming the response on the back end and they send it to the front end. But if you want to create some direct communication, you can just use GraphQL, call the API, resolve everything, and then send it back to the user. So you don't even need to worry about transforming anything, okay? As long as you write your GraphQL type and then write the query, you'll be fine. You don't have to worry about taking each field and then changing it up and then deleting certain fields. You don't have to worry about that. So with GraphQL, we also have strict definitions of queries with types. So for example, you can see over here, let's say if we have this hero type, and there are certain fields that you just can't put in. It'll throw an error if you try to make that call. So there's a strict type definition with GraphQL. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. Now, obviously, if you have like an application that has a lot of relational data that lives on different endpoints. So let's say if, for example, if you were to have, let me actually open up Notepad so you guys can see an example. So over here, let's say, for example, if I have /API/users, /API/users/posts, /API/users/messages, right? And let's say, for example, you want to build out some kind of user interface that wants to display all of the users' posts, like the most recent posts, their most recent messages, and then maybe something like, their analytics, for example, okay? Well, obviously there are many ways that you can tackle this problem. One thing you can do is you can create a single endpoint. So you can do something like /API/users, and then, dashboard data, something like that. And then this dashboard data would return the posts, messages, analytics, and maybe a user type or user object, right? Sometimes people don't like doing this because you end up creating one function that does way too many things. But ideally in like a database, you could probably just make this like an inner join. Shouldn't be too bad. But over time, you might have even more data, okay? And GraphQL solves this issue. So you don't have to keep on, adding more and more and more stuff to this endpoint. You can just let GraphQL's resolvers take care of everything for you. Okay, so hopefully all of this made sense. And if it doesn't, we're going to go ahead and look at a simple example. I'm going to show you guys how to set it up. And hopefully by then, it'll make even more sense. And you'll kind of see the differences between GraphQL and a REST API. So let's go ahead and get started on building up our GraphQL server. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that GraphQL is language agnostic. What this means is that it doesn't matter what language you use, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's TypeScript, whether it's Java, Python, doesn't matter. Okay, GraphQL is going to work with any language. So even if you want to use GraphQL for, let's say, something else, like a different language, that's more than fine, okay? It's basically just a specification, okay? So you can read through it. And the documentation has some nice examples too. But we're going to go ahead and get started with setting up our environment with Express. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install Apollo Server Express. So this is the GraphQL server that we're going to use. Okay, and we're also going to need to install Express as well. And we're also going to make sure we have TypeScript, because I am going to be using TypeScript, but you don't have to use TypeScript if you don't want to. Okay, you should be able to follow along just fine even without TypeScript. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'll call this GraphQL tutorial. Let's cd into there. And what we're going to do is I'm going to use yarn init-y. You can use npm if you want to. Just do npm init-y. That'll initialize this project for us with a package.json. And now we can install dependencies. So I'm actually just open up Visual Studio Code first. Okay. And so right now we don't have any dependencies, so let's install a couple. So let's first install Express. Let's install Apollo Server Express. And I think that should be it. Oh wait, it's yarn add. Alright, so that should take a couple seconds, shouldn't take too long. There we go. And you can see over here we have our dependencies. We have Apollo Server Express and Express. So now we need to install TypeScript. Let's do that. Install yarn add -d. So this will save it as a dev dependency because we have the -d. So let's say TypeScript first, and then let's do types Express. And I'm not sure if we need to install types for Apollo Server Express. We'll do that if we need to later. I've actually never really used this this library before, but it should be just fine. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a source folder, and I'm going to go ahead and create an index.ts file. Now I'm going to go ahead and set up a quick dev script real quick. So I'm going to do that inside the package.json file. I'll set up the start script, which this is going to basically start the Node.js application for us. This is going to start the compiled one, okay? So we need to specify the compiled directory. So that's going to be dist. You can name it whatever you want. I'll actually show you how to set that up in just a sec. And it's going to run the index.js file, which is the compiled version of our index.ts. Okay, and again, if you're not using TypeScript, you don't have to worry about this stuff. Okay, so if you're using TypeScript, you can just do node./source/index.js. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and do dev, and I have NodeMon installed on my system globally, but I'm actually going to also install it as a dev dependency, just in case, because I'm going to leave this code in the description. So even if you don't have it installed globally, it would work just fine locally, because it will install this into the bin folder. So it should work just fine. So I'm going to install that locally just to be safe, and then we're going to go ahead and do nodemon ./source/index.ts. So this will basically allow us to write our code in our TypeScript file, or any file inside the source folder. And every single time we make a change, it will auto restart our application for us, which is going to save us a lot of time. Okay, now let me go ahead and initialize my directory with a TypeScript, a tsconfig file. Now I actually already have TypeScript installed globally, so I can just do tsc-init. But if you don't have TypeScript installed globally, what you can do is you can actually just set up a quick tsc script, or name it whatever you want. I'll just name it tsc, and have it mapped to this tsc command, because we have TypeScript installed locally. So you should see this binary over here, tsc. By default, Node will look inside this .bin folder to execute any binaries whenever you specify the command. So you can just do tsc-init, but since we have this command, we can just do yarn tsc and then pass in the flag. If you're using npm, you can just do npm run tsc init like that. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So let's initialize our tsconfig, and we're good to go. So with this tsconfig, let me just go ahead and delete some of the stuff because it really does come with a lot of comments. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go to outdir. So this is basically the output structure. So whenever we compile our TypeScript, this is where we want to go. Now notice how I named the compiled folder dist. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and name the outer as dist. Okay, and everything else, you can just leave all this stuff alone. You don't have to worry so much about that. Okay, it does come with a lot of different options, which makes it nice because you can easily configure TypeScript. So I would highly recommend you guys look into TypeScript if you aren't too familiar with it, because it is very, very nice to use, in my opinion. Okay, let's see what's going on here. All right, there we go. Just wanted to get rid of some of these comments. All right, perfect. All right, and I'm also going to do one more thing. So let me also do exclude. So I want to exclude the node modules folder, and I want to include source. So I only want to, let's see. Yeah, I only want to compile stuff inside the source folder. So anything outside of it shouldn't be compiled. Okay, so now let's run our build script. So we can actually just build our TypeScript by just doing tsc. Okay, and since we already have this command over here, you can just run yarn tsc, and you'll see that we have this folder and we have index.js. Okay, so now whenever we do yarn start or npm run start or npm start, it will do node./dist right over here, index.js. Okay, so we don't need to actually do /source. We can just do /index.js. All right, so that's all we need to do for the setup of TypeScript. Now let's go ahead and set up our project with GraphQL. So first we need to import Express. So let's do import Express from Express. And I'm going to go ahead and set up a port. So we'll do process.env.port. If this is undefined, and we will just run it on port 3001. Now I don't have any environment variables set for this port, so it's going to be undefined. So we'll just use port 3001. Okay. Now we need to also require Apollo Server Express, and then we need to import Apollo Server and then GQL. So GQL, this is a function that we can actually use to create the schemas and the types. So I'll show you guys how to use it in just a sec. But first, let's import from Apollo Server Express. Okay, great. I don't think I need to install the types, so that's good. If I did need to install types, it would complain about it right over here, but that's fine. So let's go ahead and create our Express app. Okay, and now we're not going to go ahead and do app.listen. We're going to go ahead and do, we're going to create an Apollo server. So in the documentation, it shows you how to do that. So const server equals new Apollo server. And then we need to pass in our type defs, so type definitions, and then all of our resolvers. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So const called GraphQL server equals new Apollo server. And we need to pass in our type defs, and then we need to pass in our resolvers. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create these inside a separate folder, and I'm going to import that inside this index.ts just to separate them. And now we just simply do GraphQL server dot apply middleware, and then you want to pass in your Express app. So that's going to be this app property, which is going to point to this app variable over here. So instead of having to do app, we can just pass an app, which is a shorthand. All right, so now that we have applied the middleware, okay, we just need to call app.listen. Okay, we're going to specify the ports, and then we should be good to go. So app.listen port, and what I'm going to do is I'll just write a simple console log. So we'll say, let's see, console log running on port GraphQL server is running on, and then we'll just do GraphQL server.GraphQL path. So just so we get some nice logs. Okay, there we go. Now we're gonna get an error because we don't have these two things defined. But if you don't pass in anything over here, and if you try to run your app, so let's run it using yarn dev or npm run dev, you're gonna get this error. It says Apollo server requires either an existing schema, modules, or type defs. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a folder, and I'll just call this GraphQL, and I'll just call this file index.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and do this. So what we want to do is we want to create our type definitions, and we want to create our resolvers. So before we even do that, what exactly are type definitions and what exactly are resolvers? Well, first of all, our type definitions, right? So GraphQL follows a type system. So what we do is we basically create our own custom type, and that type would reflect how our data should be represented when we send it to the client. And even when they make requests to it, they need to also make sure they are following our type as well. So for example, you can see over here that we have a character type, and the character has a string, and then it appears in episode, if you can see in this example. And this episode over here is also a type. Okay, so you can kind of think of it like object-oriented programming, where you have a class, and that class may aggregate other classes and might have other, fields that have a type of another class. So you can kind of think of it like that. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So we need to create our types, okay, and then we need to create what's called a resolver. And resolvers are basically just functions that will end up resolving our values for us. Okay, it'll return whatever it is that we need to return. So if the user asks for, let's say, the hero type, and they ask for the name, the resolver is only going to give back the name. Okay, so if it doesn't see anything else, it's not going to give back anything else either than what the user asks for. So that's why we have resolvers and we have types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a simple type def. So I'll just do something like, let's see, export type def, or export const type def. And we want to use this GQL function. So just going to import that from up there. And then we can use template literals. And now what I can do is I can simply create my type. So we first need to have the root query. So we have type query. And then if we need to do anything with like updating, we would use what's called a mutation. So querying, you can think of querying like making a GET request. So anything that you want to do that has to do with reading only. So if you want to just get the user's details, you would use a query. If you wanted to if you want to update the user, for example, or update a specific document in a database or some record, you would use a mutation. Mutations are like post requests, put, delete, etc. Okay, so those are the two main things that you should remember: queries and then mutations. Okay, but let's go ahead and create a query first. So after we create the query, we're gonna have to create what's called our own custom, field over here called getHello, and we want to specify what exactly it is that it's going to return. So you can see over here that they have hello, but I like to prefix my queries with a get. So we're going to call this getHello, and it's going to return a string. So this is a data type that is part of the GraphQL's schema definition language. Okay, like I said, they have a bunch of different types. They have type language. You can see GraphQL service can be written in any language. Let me see if I can find it over here. Yeah. So we have integers, we have floats, strings, boolean, and we have also IDs. Okay, and you can also create your custom scalar types too if you want to. All right, so now we have our root query. Let's go ahead and create our resolvers. So with our resolvers, like I said, they're just functions that is going to end up resolving our data for us. And you can see over here we have a simple resolver. And then this query has a simple resolver for hello, and it just returns a string right over here. So we're going to go ahead and do that real quick. So query, and then we're going to do get hello, and then we'll just say hello world. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and import that from up here. So type defs resolvers from GraphQL. Okay, and since these two are inside the index.ts, I don't need to include the index.ts file. Alright, so our server should be running, as you can see over here. So running on port 3001, GraphQL server is running on /GraphQL. It should actually be port 3001 /GraphQL. Okay, so yeah, by default, it will run on this input over here. I think you can change it if you really want to, but we don't need to worry about that for now, at least. Okay, so let me go ahead and go to localhost port 2001 GraphQL. Let me show you what it looks like. So when you go ahead and when you open up the GraphQL playground, this is what the GraphQL playground is. It's basically a client that you can use to make requests to your GraphQL server. So keep in mind that GraphQL and REST, they are different things. So you cannot make like an HTTP GET request to a GraphQL server. They're incompatible. Okay, but you need what's called a GraphQL client to actually communicate with the GraphQL server. And that's what we have over here. We have a simple playground. Now, whenever you are building a full stack application on the front end, what you'll do is you will install something like Apollo client, and you'll use that to interact with your GraphQL API. In reality, all it really is under the hood is just a post request that is formatted in a specific way so that it can be interpreted by the GraphQL server. And if you also have Postman, you can also use Postman to send your queries to. Let's go ahead and start off by creating a simple query. So we can do that by doing, let me zoom in a little bit. We can do it by saying query and then curly braces. And what we want to do after is we want to specify the query that we want to go for. So that's hello or get hello. So we type get hello. If I do that, you can see it just returns hello world. Now obviously this is a very, very simple one, okay? But we can obviously do a lot more with this. So let's say, for example, if we want to return, let's say, a user. Well, let's go ahead and create a simple user type. So we can do that. So we can do something like type user. And let's go ahead and do name, string. Let's do email is also string. Age, int. And then we'll also do ID, which we can do ID. Okay, now in GraphQL, you can use the exclamation mark. This basically denotes this field as non-nullable, which means that there must be a present value over there. Okay, it just can't be null. So we'll leave the ID as not null. All right, let's just make sure everything is good. Yep, everything's fine. And I'll create another query called getUser, and this just returns a user. Okay, so now what we'll do is we need to make sure we also create the resolver. If I go over to my GraphQL playground, and if I try to do get user, you're going to see it's going to give me a red line. Okay, the reason why is because we are, and I actually also won't even let you make the query as well, because you need to actually ask for at least one field. Okay, so if I ask for the ID, that'll get rid of the red line over there. We're going to see it says null because we don't have the resolver taking care of that. So let's do that. So let's create the resolver. So get user. Okay, notice how it's the same name as over here. And what we can do is we can just return a user. So I'll just return a fake user real quick. Oh, actually, there shouldn't be parentheses there. Sorry about that. All right, let me just return a fake user. So we'll just return an ID. Let's just do 123. Name Arizona. For the email, I'll do arizona@gmail.com. And then for age, we'll do 23. Okay, so let's save, and let's go over here. And you can see now it returns the ID of 123. If I want to do name, it'll give me the name, and notice how it's not giving me everything. It's only giving me what I ask for, and you can kind of see why this is actually good, because I can only ask for what it is that I want, and I don't have to worry about other fields. So sure, maybe the API might give back 100 different fields, but you only ever care about 5 of them. Do you really want to, let's say for example, if you're using TypeScript, right? Do you really want to, write an entire interface that mocks the whole entire API's response? Not really. You only want the things that you know for sure that you want, that you're ever going to use. Okay? So if I ask for everything, it's going to give me everything. Okay? And there's no way that you can make it so that it will give you everything just by default. That will defeat the whole purpose of GraphQL. Okay? Alright, so that's pretty cool. But this is obviously hard-coded. But how do we make it so that it's dynamic? All right, we want to make it so that we can, let's say, for example, pass in an argument, like let's say the ID, and then we can go ahead and actually, use that ID on a resolver, search for a user by its ID, and then we can return it back. So how do we do that? Well, we can actually create queries that take in arguments. So I will also mention that there should be a lot of documentation on here, if I remember correctly, But if not, yeah, I think right over here. Yep, the Apollo server. There's a lot of documentation here that you can go through that they kind of show you how to, do certain things. But don't worry, we're going to walk through each thing step by step. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and create a query called getUserById. And it's going to basically take in a ID. Okay, now I think the ID usually it can be a number, it could be a string, okay? But we're going to use that as a string. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get the ID from the resolver function. So the resolver function actually has arguments that it can be taken in. Yeah, so you can see over here, handling arguments, there is an example, type query, user, you pass in, or it expects an ID and it returns a user type up here. Okay, and then you can see over here, yep, perfect, right over here. In our resolver, you can see that our resolver function takes in parent, args, context, and info. So parent refers to the actual parent type. So in GraphQL, you'll probably end up having a lot of nested objects that will resort to types. So for example, a user might have a bunch of posts, right? And this would probably return an array or a list of posts. Now, we denote arrays in GraphQL's types with the square brackets, and in between the square brackets, we place the type in there. So this over here represents a array of posts. So you don't do this, you don't do this, you do this. Okay? But we would have to obviously create the post. But if, let's say for example, if we're in the resolver and we are trying to resolve this subfield over here, okay, this subfield would have the parent parameter, and that parent parameter would resort to the user type. Because let's say for example you want to get the user by its ID, and then you want to get all of the user's posts, right? Well, you don't want to get the posts for every single user. You need a way to get the posts by the user's ID. So how do we get the ID that we pass in? Well, you reference the parent. And we'll look at some examples later on, so don't worry. Okay, but for now, let me just start with a simple example. So we'll create something called getUserById. And I'll just do ID, and this will be an ID, because that's the type. And then this will return a user, not a string. Sorry about that. And we'll create the resolver. So getUserById. And then over here, we can have all of our parameters over here. So we have parent, args, context, info. So you can see the documentation also tells you everything. So you can see the args argument is an object that contains all GraphQL arguments that were provided for the field by the GraphQL operation. And I already mentioned what parent is. I think for context, that resorts to the actual HTTP context, if I remember correctly. An object shared across all resolvers that are executing for a particular operation. Yeah, you can see over here it actually gives you can actually get the request object. So you can actually use this to check to see if the user is authenticated or not. So that's very useful to know. But let's go back to here. So let's take in our arguments, and I think info is just information about the execution state. All right, but we're going to focus on just the parent, args, context, info. Now I actually don't even know the types for these, if I'm being honest with you. I wonder if Apollo actually has the types. But I think I might need to actually install the types definition. Give me one sec. Alright, so I don't think Apollo Server Express actually has type definitions, which I guess makes sense because these arguments can really be, I think they're non-deterministic, so it's really hard to tell. If you know what your parameters are going to look like if you know what is going to be passed into your queries, then you can easily just create type definitions for it. I forgot to put the colon over here. Keep forgetting that. All right, let me actually just console log everything, just so I can see everything and what it looks like, so I know how to shape the interface or the type definition. All right, so let's go ahead and actually use our new query. So just make sure you refresh the GraphQL playground page because it doesn't auto update. So let's call getUserById. Now let's pass in the ID, and you can see we get an error because we need to pass in an ID. Okay, this ID is non-nullable. We need to have it. So let's pass in 1, 2, 3. You can also put it in between quotes as well. Now it's going to return null. Okay, that's fine because we haven't actually returned anything. But I want to show you the console log so you guys can see what's being logged. So we have logged the parent, args, context info in that specific order. So let's go from the top. So you can see we have undefined. So that's the parent. Remember, it's undefined because this query get user by ID. Okay, for this specific resolver, we don't have any parent. For the second object, args, we have ID 1, 2, 3. So that's how we're going to get the ID. Okay, then we have the context, and then we have the info, which, like I said, we're not going to worry so much about those things. We're only going to focus on the parent and the args. So the parent is going to be null, so we don't really need that. We only need to worry about the args. So we're going to go ahead and just create a custom type. So we'll do export user args type. And then right now we only have ID. Oh, I forgot the type. Right now we only have ID, but we might have more later on. Okay, so we'll just type annotate that. So at least we have some IntelliSense. If you were to add more IDs or more fields, let's say username, you can also add that as well. Okay, but we'll just leave this like that for now. So let's go ahead and then let's create an array. So this is going to be kind of like a fake database. In reality, all you do is you would just import whatever database provider you're using, like MongoDB or MySQL, and you would just create that query, and then it would return that data from the database, and you just give it back to the user. But because we don't really have that much time, I'm just going to use an array. So let's do constant users, and I wish I had created a type for this. There should be a way. I think there is a way that you can share types with interfaces. I know in Nest.js it'll automatically generate your schemas into actual TypeScript, either classes or interface, so you can reuse them. But I think we are out of luck for this one. I'm going to go and just create 3 users, and every single one of them will have the same field. So ID 1, 2, 3. Let's give it a name. Let's do Arizona. Email arizona@arizona.com. And then age, let's just do 20. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this over and over again. Change up the ID. Change up the name. And then we'll do, I don't know, we'll do Ryan for this one. I'll do one more. Let me actually change the ID for this one. And for this one, let's do Christina. And then we'll do 25. All right, so now we have our users, okay? And what we're gonna do is let's go ahead and destructure the ID. And we know for a fact this is going to be truthy because we are expecting this to be provided. If it's not provided, then it's going to throw an error. So it's kind of like it already does some validation for us, but you can also do more validation if you want. So what I'll do is I'm going to reference this array up here, and I'll just do return users.find. I'm going to find it by the user.id. Okay, so this is going to search for a user on the array, and if it's truthy, it will return that. If it's false, it will just return a null. So let's look at how this works. So let's do 1, 2, 3. You can see now we actually are getting some stuff. Let's get the name, age, and email. There we go. Let's do 1, 2, 4. We have Mike. 1, 2, 5, Ryan. 1, 2, 6, Christina. 1, 2, 7 would be null. Okay, that's pretty simple. Pretty simple stuff. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And you can see that if we pass in something that doesn't exist in our quote-unquote database, it'll just return a null. Okay, so like I said, if you're using an actual database, all you would literally do is just import Mongoose, SQLize, whatever type RM, whatever library you're using. You would, place the query right over here, query for data, and then you would return it. Okay, well, maybe you might not necessarily return it ASAP, but you might do other things. But you guys get the idea, I hope. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now let's go ahead and make this a little bit more fun. So in an actual application, the user might have another field that maps to a specific type. So the user, like I said earlier, the user might have a post, right? Well, our user might have something like, I don't know, a payment method, right? So let's create that. And for this payment method, we'll give it some fields. We'll give it an ID, and we'll just say it's an ID type. We'll give it, let's say, the last 4. This is going to be a string. Expiration month. This will be an integer. Whoops, not interface, integer. Year, so that's expiration year. That'll be an int. Okay, so this is just like obviously basic data of the payment method. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead inside our user type, and we're gonna say payment method, and this is going to resort to a payment method type. Okay, and like I said earlier, the exclamation mark makes it non-nullable. Okay, so because the user might not have a payment method, we don't want to do an exclamation mark right after it. Okay, so now that we have the payment method, well, how do we actually make it so that it will actually query the payment method? Right? How do we actually make it so that it will get the payment method? Well, what we can do is inside our resolvers, we can create a user resolver. Remember, this is our root query. We can create more, or this is our, I should say, root resolver. Okay, we can create more resolvers. So I can do user, okay, and that will result to this one. And I can say, hey, look, get me the payment method. So that will correspond to this payment method over here. Okay, and this payment method is going to be a function, and it's going to take in a parent, and then an args, any. And since we don't really pass in any args for payment method, the args will be an empty object. Okay, but let's go ahead and console log the parent object, and this time you're going to notice that it's actually going to not be undefined. It's actually going to have a truthy value. So let me refresh, and now I can do payment method. If I do ID, you're going to see it says null because we're not returning anything from that nested resolver. But if you look over here down in the bottom, we have a console log, and it shows the parent. And the parent, this over here, is the user type. The ID, name, email, age. Okay, that's the user type. So now if you want, you can create a custom TypeScript type called user, and you can type annotate the parent if you want to. I'd encourage you guys to do that. You know what? Let's actually do it real quick. Export type user. Now it's gonna be a little bit tricky, so we're gonna do ID string, name string, email string, age number. And we're gonna, now you're gonna notice that in the parent object it didn't log payment method. That's fine. I'm gonna go ahead and just make this an optional because it could be undefined. All right, and then we'll also need a payment method type as well. So let's create that. And we'll need the ID, last 4, which is a string, x month number, x year number. Okay, and now we can do this, and then we should be good to go. It's starting to get a little bit messy, so I'll probably end up putting everything in a separate file later, but we'll leave that alone for now. Okay, so let me go ahead and just type annotate this to be a user. So now I can reference, I have IntelliSense now, and it doesn't really make much of a difference, but I know that if I try to reference payment method, it will be undefined. Okay, that's fine. So now, what you can do is with the parent object, right, if we go back and if we look at the actual log, you can see we have the ID, we have the name, email, and etc. And what you can do with this is you can actually use it to query your database for a payment method that may live in its own table, right? And this is why I said earlier that GraphQL is amazing for applications that use that have a lot of relational data. So now this resolver can take care of resolving the payment method, and it will have nothing to do with this specific, this specific function over here. So that makes it really awesome. Okay, so what we can do is we can say, hey, look, you know what? Let's create a bunch of payment methods, and let me actually go ahead and just do something right over here. I'm gonna call this data. Just put all my data files over here, so we don't have such a messy file just full of random stuff. Okay. So let's go ahead and also place our types somewhere. I'll place inside types.ts. And I'm going to do that over here, put that over here. Okay. And what I'll also do is I'm also going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to import the user type. So that way I actually have IntelliSense over here. Before we didn't. And you can see that payment method is undefined. Okay. Ideally, in an actual database like MySQL, you would have a foreign key from payment method mapping to this user table. In something like MongoDB, you'd probably have everything just listed all together. Okay. But let's go ahead and do this. So user args type. Let's see what's going on over here. User has any type. So we'll do user. Cannot find any users. We got to import users as well. Okay, so we just import everything. All right, perfect. So now let's go ahead and create some payment methods. So export const payment methods, payment method. And now all we got to do, this should be square bracket, sorry. All right, so now we got to do is we just got to create our payment methods. Okay, so what I'll do is for the ID, I'm going to let that ID map to the user's ID. Okay, so remember we have this foreign key. Actually, let me do this. Let me do user ID string. There we go. Because like I said earlier that you would have a foreign key. We'll let this user ID be the foreign key. So this ID will be unique for the payment method, and this user ID will not be unique, but it'll map to the user ID over here. The reason why I say it's not unique is because with foreign keys, they can be duplicate. Okay? So this will basically be a one-to-many relationship. So let's go ahead and create some simple payment methods. So we'll just do something like, one, the last four. We'll do, 4, 5, 6, 7. Just like some fake data. Expiration month, we'll do August. Expiration year, we'll do 2021. And the user ID, this will map to 1, 2, 3. Okay? So now let's go ahead and create a couple. So what I'm going to do is let me make this 2. Let me also just change the number. And we actually need to change our type in just a sec, because I just realized that the user may actually have more than one payment method. Again, depends on how you structure your app, but we're going to make this an array. Okay, just a quick fix. And let me go ahead and just create an ID of 3. We'll leave this alone. Okay, and this will be for user ID 124. So if you look over here, we have a user ID of 123, 124, 125, 126. All right, so let's go ahead and create this. And let's just change this to 2022, and this will be for user 125. And I'll just copy and paste this 3 times, and then we'll create one for 126. All right, perfect. All right, so one thing that I need to also change is for our TypeScript type. We're going to make this a payment method, an array of payment methods. And now inside our GraphQL.index.ts file, or GraphQL/index.ts file, inside payment method, make sure you import that payment methods array over here, from here to here. And we're going to go ahead and call the .filter function. So this is going to filter through the array, and it's going to give us only the payment methods that match the user's ID. So how do we write this predicate function? We simply say payment.userid equals parent.id. Remember, the user ID, okay, is going to basically have a relationship with this user ID in the payment method field over here, or the field in this payment method. Okay, so we're saying user ID, which is this one over here, needs to match user.id. Okay, so hopefully that is crystal clear. So now we're going to go into our query, and there we go. So let's go ahead and do last 4. Let's do expiration month, expiration year. We had all that, and just to make sure everything's correct, we can see that 124 the user 124, which is Mike, only has one payment method. If we were to change the ID to 123, it would give you 2. We change it to 125, it would give you 3. And we change it to 126, it would give you 1. So that's pretty cool. And now, again, if you want, let's say for example, the payment method may have a field that maps to another type, right? I can't think of one right now, but think of any, right? The payment method could map to, let's say, something else. Let's say it maps to some random object, and this is a type, random type. Well, how would you resolve this value though? Well, you would go over here into your resolvers and you would create the resolver function on the payment method type for random object. So random object is going to be this function, and it's going to take in a parent, which is going to have an any data type, and then you would apply your actual logic over here. Okay, so hopefully this all makes sense. So far we've only done querying. We haven't really touched mutations yet. All right, so what I'm going to do to end this video is I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to do a quick GraphQL mutation. So it's pretty easy, but let's go ahead and get started with that. So first of all, I briefly mentioned earlier what exactly a mutation is, and all a mutation is whenever you want to make an update or create a new resource, you would use what's called a mutation. Okay, so querying, like I said, is the equivalent of just making an HTTP GET request, and creating a mutation for your GraphQL API is literally the same as making a POST request, a PUT, a delete, etc. Okay, so if, let's say for example, if we want to populate our database with data, or if we want to add a new user, we would use a mutation. Okay, and the way we create mutations is very similar to how we would create a query. So let's go ahead and create a mutation. All right, so if you actually look at the documentation, you can see how a typical mutation definition for your schema would look like. So we have type mutation, and then we have this function over here, add book, or the, not the function, but the definition of it, the signature. And you can see it takes in 2 parameters, and it returns a book type. So it takes in the title, which is a string, and then author is a string. Okay, so like I said, I would encourage you guys to read the documentation, but let's go ahead and create our own GraphQL mutation. So we're going to go up here into type defs, okay, and we're going to say type mutation, and we're going to go ahead and do create user. And what we're going to do for this is we're going to go ahead and we'll just expect them to pass an ID. We'll expect them to pass the name, which is going to be a string. And I'm going to use exclamation marks because everything is going to be non-nullable. They need to have all these. And then we're going to have age, which is an int. And this will return a user. Okay, so let's save, and our server is working just fine. So if I go over to here, GraphQL, and if I want to make a mutation, so instead of doing query now, we have to actually do mutation. So for example, let me actually open up a new tab. If I try to do something like query create user, it's not going to work, right? Because it's a mutation. So we have to do mutation create user, and look at all of the fields. So ID 123, name, and you can see underneath it will tell you it's a string, the data type, and it's also non-nullable, so it's required. So let's do Danny. Age will do 24. And if I try to do like a string 24, it should give me an error. But let's pass in email danny@gmail.com. Let me zoom out a little bit because I'm running out of space. Though I think there should be a way to kind of like auto format it. Okay. I think by default it might actually just auto fix it for you. I'm not sure. Alright, so let's do name, email, and then age. So obviously this is not going to do anything. We're not doing anything. We don't have the resolver for this mutation, so we'll have to create that. So we have to go down over here. I'm going to put this right underneath query. So we'll say mutation. And then we'll go ahead and do this. So we'll say create user. And this is going to take in, remember, the parent, and then args. And args should be user args type. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same one, but I'm also just going to make all of these fields available in here. So right over here. But I'll make them all optional. Okay, well, typically, actually, they wouldn't necessarily be optional if we think about it, but it depends. If we try to reference it over here, obviously, they'll be optional. So there's no guarantee, but I'll leave it like this for now. So let's just console log everything just to make sure that we know exactly what's going on. We're not going to move too fast. We want to move in small steps. So let's click play. And if I show you the console log, you're going to see it says undefined for the parent. And you can see over here that we have our user that we want to add. Okay, so now all we literally do is we can simply just destructure everything. We can push it to the array. It's pretty simple. I mean, obviously over here, you would still probably want to do some validation maybe. So for example, you would want to check to see if the user is already inside the database or the array. And you would add it if it's not, and if it is, you could like throw an error or something, or send like an invalid message. I don't know, or you can just send null. Okay, but since we already made it required to pass in all 4 of those fields, I'm just simply gonna do this, and I wouldn't recommend doing this because it's actually we can't because we're using TypeScript. I forgot this is TypeScript, not JavaScript, because I was thinking about just pushing args, so I was thinking about just doing users.push args, but that wouldn't work because they're different types. You're gonna see it says, let's see what it says over here. String undefined. Why is it saying string? Oh, argument of type user args type is not assignable to parameter of type user. Okay, so we'll actually have to destructure everything. So I'll just say user, and we'll just say ID args.id. Actually, let me do this. Okay, let's do that. And let's just say new user equals name, email, age. Let's go over here. Oh, that's because they're all undefined. That's why. All right, you know what? I'm going to leave this alone. I'm just going to get rid of all that. Because we have strict mode on, or we have a TypeScript set to strict, so that's why. All right, so I'm going to pass it there. And let's return user. So let's try this out. So this is Danny. So it has an ID, a conflicting ID. Let's actually change this to something else. So that way we don't have a conflict when we search for our user. So I'll do 127. Okay. Now if I go over here and if I do 127, you see we have Danny. Okay, now if I wanted to add a payment method for our new user, again we can create the mutation up here. So you can say create payment method or attach payment, whatever you want to call it, and we'll pass in an ID. But typically you necessarily don't want to pass in the ID because the database would take care of generating the ID for you. But just for this tutorial, I'm going to do that. So let's do, well, not name, last 4, string, x month, expiration month number, expiration year number, and then the user ID. This is 4, so this will be an ID as well. So take advantage of the scalar types, or not scalar, but the default GraphQL types. So we have our create payment method. Good. So let's create our resolver for this. So create payment method, and we're going to go ahead and say parent any. And you should already know what the args are. The args should literally be a payment method. I'm going to go ahead and just cheat a little bit. I would not do this in an actual project, but I'm going to use the same payment method type that I have for this. Normally I would create a separate type called payment method params, and I would leave that as a type there, but just to make things simple, like I would do something like this. and then use this instead, right? Because this type should really be using to represent an actual payment method and not be used for like things like arguments and stuff like that. But I'm going to cheat and just do that for a little bit. Right, so, and because I'm doing that, I can just actually just push this in. This is why I say I'm cheating, okay? But in an actual application, you wouldn't do that. So this works just fine. All right. What's going on over here? I have an error somewhere. It says unknown type number. Did I accidentally do something wrong? It says unknown type number. Did you mean user? Where's it? What is it talking about? I can't really tell. Oh, whoops. Sorry about that. I keep getting confused between the schema types and then the number types. I think the approach that we're taking is a schema first approach. I know there's also something called a code first approach. I think that would probably be a lot better, so that you don't get confused between like the different data types from TypeScript and then GraphQL data types. Okay, so let's go back here and let's refresh. And now, if I try to do another mutation, I think I can do 2 mutations at the same time, I think. I should be able to. So create payment method will make this the ID. Let's see, just make sure there's no collision. Oh, I had a lot of collisions over here. Let me just fix that, just so we can be consistent. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So let's go ahead and pass in 8. You also need the last 4, so that's going to be a string. We'll do 3, 4, 5. The expiration month will be 12. We'll leave the year as 2022 for the expiration year, and I think the last we need is user ID, which is going to be 127. So that's going to be for Danny. Okay, so this 127 is going to map to that. You'd pass in whatever ID you want to add this payment method for. And we'll take in the ID, we'll take in the last 4, expiration month, expiration year, and then user ID. Wait, hold on. Create payment method should return a pay method. Oh, I forgot to provide the user ID field over here. There we go. Okay. All right, perfect. So there we go. Now right now, if I try to search this, it's going to give me a bunch because I just sent a bunch of requests. That's fine because we aren't doing any validation, but hopefully this makes sense. Now, if I wanted to create a user, I can create another user called 128, and we'll call this guy Alex. And let's go ahead and get this the ID of 9. And then we will just simply say this is for user ID 128. So let's do that. Okay, good. Let's go over here and let's get the user by ID 128. And now it has the ID of 128. We have Alex, and then we have the pay method. And there you go. So that's going to be pretty much it for GraphQL. And now that you have learned GraphQL, you can actually use it to build out an application. So what's next, right? You learned GraphQL, what's next? Well, the reason why I did this video was because I was going to do a full stack video with Nest.js, GraphQL, and TypeORM. So I wanted to do this video so you guys are familiar with how GraphQL works. So if you guys want to, you guys can either create your own small project with GraphQL, incorporate GraphQL into that project, or we can go into the full stack Discord dashboard bot tutorial and you can watch it and you can try to understand what's going on with GraphQL. Okay, it might be a little bit different because we're using Nest.js. With that being said, hopefully you guys enjoyed this lengthy GraphQL tutorial, and I hope it served a good purpose for you guys. I know it was pretty long. I personally don't like doing such long videos, but I feel like we definitely did cover a lot of things, right? We talked about how to query an individual data. We can query by ID. We talked about resolvers and how we can handle sub-resolvers, right, to resolve certain fields. And we also did mutations as well. We created some users, created pay methods. And that's pretty much it. So what I'll do is I will leave the code in the description, and I'm gonna have a README. I'm gonna have a README, and it's gonna explain everything for you guys. So hopefully you guys will find it useful, and that's pretty much it. So I will see you guys in my next video. Peace out.